With the rise of elation meta, there's constant debate on how powerful certain characters are. Is a new character T0? It's almost as if any character that is not instantly T0 is not good and incapable of clearing endgame at all. That simply isn't the case. Even T2 and T3 characters are capable of full starring the endgame. But the idea that you must always get the newest character clouds people's judgment. There's also the misconception that people take these tier lists as gospels, not realizing that in some cases, some of the lower tier characters can outperform the higher tier characters in certain specific scenarios. I won't really discuss about supports since they're mostly dependent on the DPS they're supporting. So what exactly makes the DPS T0? I'm going to use Prydwen as a guideline because that's the tier list that most people use when they talk about the ranking of a character. Prydwen uses average data, but it also trims off the top 25% and the bottom 25% of data to make it less skewed, so they're mostly using the interquartile mean. In the contrary, the Herd of the Calm and archive where the best of the best players submit their clears, their data will obviously not be accounted for, as they represent the best players. Prydwen will represent the average data in this case, while the Genius archive will consist of the top clears. So I'm going to use this current mock to look at the data that Prydwen has collected. Here we can toggle between E0S0, E0S1, and E2S1. The current mock doesn't have enough data for Mortonak's Blade yet, so he is not included here. However, we can see some fluctuations here, notably how Firefly is much stronger at E2 than she is at E0, and how at S0 there's not a lot of data, presumably because most people these days also poll for light cones. Here, the reason Sparksy sub DPS data is higher than Silverwolf is most likely because Sparksy as a sub DPS is on all Silverwolf teams, but not the other way around, making Silverwolf's data lower. Another interesting phenomenon here is that Naxa as a DPS is ranked higher at E0S1, but lower at E2S1, most likely due to his poor vertical investments. Finon and Fei Xiao also both see a huge jump in E2 over Hyslins and Archer who are rated T0 due to how strong their E2 are. Here we can clearly see why the T0 DPS are ranked the way they are due to their higher average data across the board. The other less meta characters below T1 have little to no data as shown here, so it's harder to gauge your strength directly, but this just means very little people are actually playing them in the endgame. However, there are still some flaws in Prydwen's own criteria, I should say. In Pure Fiction here, it only accounts for total score, not cycle clears, meaning if a character is capable of clearing 40k in 3 cycles versus another character who can do it easily at 40k but 0 cycle, that data will not be reflected here. APOC is kind of the same as Mach, just accounts for total score instead. Prydwen also doesn't collect data for anomaly, so that isn't reflected here as well. So I don't necessarily completely agree with Prydwen's ranking. It's not a bad baseline, and it's a pretty good general guideline for casual players, but average data means it only takes into account of a character's average strength. A decent portion of the player base only use auto battles or have subpar knowledge on how to play a character, and this can also lead to great discrepancies, as some characters are harder and easier to use. On the Genius archive, you can see that Casters isn't as dominant. Here you can see in the hands of the more skilled players, she requires significantly more cost to compete with other supposed lower ranking DPS. Does this mean she's bad? No, not at all. But other characters with a bit of investment will outperform her. She's still very strong, just not dominant across all forms of investment. But if we were to cost max, this would put Finon and Anaxa ahead of her at the moment, despite both being ranked a whole tier below her on Prydwen. At least in my opinion, this means that the quote-unquote potential of Anaxa and Finon are greater than her if you invest enough. But at an E0 baseline, Casterus would be better than both of them. There's so far still a lack of data on Blade, so I can't really comment on him without any personal biases, but for my personal input, he's pretty broken from what I can see. You can also observe that some characters are clearly far more dominant in certain modes than others. Despite being ranked T0.5 in Pure Fiction by Prydwen, Herta has some of the fastest and cheapest clears in that mode to this day, whether it be 0 cycles or just full clearing. It's also worth pointing out, based on these clears, Zeely is technically one of the best Pure Fiction characters as of now. She is clearing faster than Herta and Monorem after her Nova Flare, and no other characters can match her performance. The only other character who is able to do that is Evanescia, but she is quite new. However, Zilly is still ranked T1 only. This is mostly because both Herta and Zilly are incredibly difficult to pilot, to be utilized to their full strengths. So the average data drags them down. But if we're going by the metric of their potential, it would make sense to say that they are much stronger than most other characters in pure fiction, except Evanescia, of course. An argument can be made that Evanescia is an elation DPS that is currently being mega showed though, so the fact that Zilly and Herta, who are much older and not really showed, can keep up is quite impressive. We can see the other T0 DPS like Casters and Sparksy routinely perform worse here, but tying back to Prydwen's average data, it is simply much easier for the average player to play Casters and Sparksy, and that's why their scores are generally higher. Before maximizing a character's potential, it would not be far-fetched to say both Herta and Zilly are much better than most of the T0.5 and even T0 characters. It's a bit crazy to think that one of the best characters in pure fiction right now is a 1.x hunt unit. This is also why Prydwen's data doesn't really account for this. Some characters are easier to play compared to others, but the skill isn't really reflected there. True potential of certain characters are far greater than people give credit for, whether due to their incompetence to play them or difficulty of piloting them. I myself am not a very great player, too. As you can watch my clears, I make a lot of mistakes. Some people might argue that Zilly and Herta are harder to play with a sustain, which is somewhat true, but this is looking at peak performance. I might discuss about sustainless meta in the future, since for some people it's apparently some scary, unknowable domain. But in short, sustainless isn't just mindless resetting. There is strategy to it. And the only character right now who 100% needs a sustain is Casters. But that's also because she actually benefits the most from having one. Even more in Axblade, My Day, and Evernight, if you can pilot them well enough, do not require a sustain. There's also APOC, but for the most part, APOC performances are quite similar to Mach, except that break characters and Anaxa tend to perform much better, mainly due to the fact that APOC wants you to break the boss's bar as soon as possible. So yeah, Anaxa's weakness implant is pretty great for that. APOC performances are also quite volatile compared to pure fiction and Mach because your score is based on the AV used. So speed breakpoints matter less, and it's just better to go as fast as possible. So certain characters might perform significantly better or worse due to this fact. The discrepancies of the score can also be seen with Eidolons. Some characters are simply far stronger with Eidolons than others. This can be seen with E2 Phynon and E2 Firefly, while characters like E2 Anaxa are a lot worse. E2 Evernight is also a powerhouse, unlike E2 Casters, who is just more average, making Evernight's potential far greater than Casters. E2 Casters is still good, just not as good as E2 Evernight. The same could be said for some supports, such as E2 Dahlia versus E2 Tingyun Fugue, where E2 Dahlia is simply the superior investment to be made. In other words, not all investments are equal. Might make a video talking about broken E2s in the future, but with E2, it's not always as clear as some characters are still T0 across all forms of investments, as certain characters get substantial boost with Eidolons, or in some cases, it's E1, like Trippy, who sees plays on some of the cheapest and fastest clears, despite being quote-unquote no longer best in slot. Which brings me to my next point. A lot of character strength are fluctuated due to the current Shilling. This can either be the buffs that the endgame gives, or the current boss mechanics. There's a certain raw damage ceiling that a team can hit, but depending on the show or the buffs, or debuffs, this can change drastically. For example, in the last Anomaly King, Phynon was actually scoring much better than Casters, and that is because the boss has a 40% quantum res. And Rappa was also scoring better than Anaxa and Casters, possibly because it had an imaginary weakness. Similarly, in a 4.0 pure fiction, there was a spike in Archer's performance because of a buff that significantly boosted damage based on skill points consumed. In a 4.0 APOC with Pollux, all the non-HP scaling team scores took a hit because it was impossible to run sustainless without Whale's level of investments. Also, in the current king, due to the HP drain, you can see that Phynon has the cheapest sustainless Plight Clear at 14 cost and 0 cycling at 18 cost, while all other DPSs need at least 35 plus cost to do it sustainless. So a stage debuff and buff can matter a lot alongside the boss mechanic on how well a character can perform. It might sound like I'm glazing Finon, but I can assure you I'm not. I don't even own Finon myself. This kit is very good for sustainless, which is a huge strength in his longevity as a character. So what is the point of all of this? It's mostly just to address the doomposting that some characters are unplayable just because they're T1 or below. By the way, T1 to T2 is still considered meta on Prydwen, so it's a bit strange people are calling them unplayable. If you search hard enough, you can still find even Downhand Inhibitor Lune is still clearing endgame. So in the hands of capable players, these lower tier characters can still perform extremely well in the endgame. They usually just need a bit more investment. Might be a bit harsh to say this, but if your E6 character can't clear, it's most likely a skill issue, unless they're Dr. Ratio or something. Sorry, but Dr. Ratio might truly be bricked. However, the exception would be Anomaly, where some characters straight up brick or can't clear at extreme whale investment. That's a different thing though, since most people only care about the traditional endgames. I understand that not everyone cares about min-maxing, but that does not mean just because the character isn't easy to play, it means they're useless in endgame, or I don't know, if they have trouble zero cycling, that they're selling trash. I guess the takeaway from this is that Prydwen Skyline is pretty great for casual players looking to pull for characters to just simply clear the endgame. But for anyone looking to maximize their performance, the Genius Archive would be a better place. I myself also use the archive a lot, can observe how these players play in order to clear. There's also the misconception that they all have godlike builds, which isn't necessarily true. You can check the builds of these uploaded clears, they're not like super amazing. Of course, some of these clears have Eidolons, which not everyone has, but I'd say learning to invest properly is a core part of the game, so that is something that every player has to decide for themselves on how they want to pull. Most lower tier characters are still capable of performing well in the endgame with moderate levels of investments. It will not be as dominant as the T0 characters, but it's disingenuous to say they're just bad. Of course, sustainless is a huge part in this, so I might make a separate video discussing that, but remember, skill and team building is a huge part on how to properly clear an endgame. I'm a huge proponent of pulling who you like. It's very likely your favorite character can still clear endgame, as long as you know how to play them. Anyways, if you found this entertaining, be sure to like and subscribe to continue supporting my Star Rail journey.